I mean, I don't work in the nuclear energy. I don't get paid by the nuclear energy, either under the table or over the table. So for both of you and me, this is a labor of love, and we think we're doing the right thing for society. We're doing the right thing for the United States, and we're doing the right thing for the rest of the world. There's millions, billions of people that still do not have access to electricity, whose lives could be so improved with just a meager amount of electricity, meager amount of energy. And so I think we're doing something good for the world.
Just because the facts are A, if the narrative is B and everyone believes the narrative, then B is what matters. But it's our job in our industry to speak up proudly, soberly, and to engage people in this dialogue. Those 2.5 billion people that are in energy poverty, they need us.
America cannot meet this threat alone.
If there is a single country,
of course, the world cannot meet it without America,
that is willing to
but we're going to need you, the next generation, to finish the job.
Nuclear regulation.
We need scientists to design new fuels.
And focus on net public benefit.
We need engineers to invent new technologies.
Over absurd levels of radiation.
Entrepreneurs to sell those technologies.
Then we will march towards this.
We need workers to operate assembly lines that hum with high-tech, zero-carbon components.
Unlimited prosperity for all humans.
We need diplomats and businessmen and women and Peace Corps volunteers to help developing nations skip past the dirty phase of development and transition to sustainable sources of energy. In other words, we need you.
Okay, welcome to Fire to Fission podcast, where we talk about energy-dense fuels and how they can better human lives. We've got an awesome topic today with Doug Sandridge. We're going to chat about oil and gas and nuclear and how they can pair together and some of the work that Doug's done. So Doug is a Senior Vice President at Fulcrum Energy Capital, and we'll chat a little bit about his day job and what he does, but we want to chat about a project, an open letter that he's been working on. So Doug, how are you doing this morning?
Fantastic. Yes, fantastic to talk to you today.
Excellent. So Doug, real quick for the audience, why don't you give kind of a background on yourself? What is Fulcrum Energy Capital? What have you done for a career? Yeah, let's start there.
All right, I guess we'll start at the beginning. I had somewhat of an unusual childhood. My dad was a petroleum geologist for Phillips Petroleum for almost 40 years. And in 1966, when I was 7 years old, he got invited to join their international department. And back then in the international department, once you went in the international department, you pretty much stayed there the rest of your career. So when we first moved overseas, we assumed that we were going to be over there most of the time. We moved to Norway, and my dad was working offshore as a geologist in the North Sea before they had even found oil and gas over there. They had a good idea it was there. He drilled wells for 2 years, and then we moved to the Netherlands after that. And it wasn't until about a year and a half after we left Norway that the first discovery was finally made. Ekofisk, I believe, was discovered in November of 1969. We had already moved to the Netherlands. So he was working in the Dutch North Sea sector, the Netherlands North Sea sector. And then we lived there a few years and lived in London, England for several years, and lived in South America, in Bogota, Colombia. And so I didn't really live in the state as a child or go to school until I came back for 10th grade, and a little bit of a culture shock to move from South America to Midland Lee High School. And, I walked in.
Was that like Midland, like Texas? Like
Midland, Texas. Yeah. Midland, Texas.
The oil field. Yeah.
Yes. So, it was fantastic. Childhood, got to see a lot of different things, moved around, obviously grew up different perspective. I'd really planned, most of my friends were going to Texas A&M. That's what I'd wanted to do, follow my friends to Texas A&M. But my dad knew that he and my sister and my mom were probably going to be moving back overseas. And so they encouraged me to think about going to University of Oklahoma because I had family in Oklahoma. And the other reason it's kind of interesting at the time in Oklahoma. If you live overseas, you don't really have an in-state tuition, do you? How do you get in-state tuition if your parents live in Africa or wherever? So turns out in Oklahoma.
And you're an American, right? Yeah.
And I'm American. I doubt that this is still the case, but at the time, Oklahoma was very gracious. Oklahoma University, if you worked for a company like Conoco or Kerr-McGee or Phillips that was headquartered in Oklahoma, they would give your kids in-state tuition if you lived overseas but were working for an Oklahoma-based company. So I went to OU and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I think I wanted to be an architect at first. And I still loved architecture, but I realized that wasn't the major for me. So my sophomore year, I declared to become a nuclear engineer. And if the truth be known, it was not because I had this burning desire to be a nuclear engineer. I just didn't know what I wanted to do, and it sounded cool. And you knew if you went out, the girls were going to be wooed. Oh yeah, I'm a nuclear engineering major. So that's why I was a nuclear engineering major, not for the right reasons, but it just so happened, and I'm revealing my age here. My sophomore year in college is the year that 3 Mile Island accident happened, and so then the nuclear world kind of blew up, and I ended up getting into oil and gas. So I worked in oil and gas for over 40 years.
Were you able to capitalize on that in-state tuition? I mean, was that
Yeah, and I did have in-state tuition there. It was
yeah,
great. So,
nice?
and I had grandparents who lived in Oklahoma City, so I had a support system there. I went home every weekend, did my laundry, got home cooked meals while my parents were living in Europe or Africa or wherever they were at the time. So it's pretty cool.
Gotcha. Yeah. So parents worked in oil and gas, kind of generation of oil and gas, and you've spent a career working in it, right?
I have. I spent most of my career really in either Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, Louisiana, and Colorado. I moved back to Colorado in 2006. My wife's a native here in Colorado, and she had followed me to Texas for 20 plus years. And so we moved back to Colorado, and I worked for a Colorado company that was actually doing business in Kansas and Texas. And then after that, that was a private equity company. And after they sold out, I went to work for Forest Oil, but I was working as their land manager for Texas, Louisiana, all things other than Colorado. And it wasn't until I joined a startup team, a private equity team, that I first worked in Colorado about 10 years ago. So I've been
Gotcha.
working on it.
But got scared of the engineering side and went and did the land.
The petroleum land management degree that I got at University of Oklahoma at the time, and I'm sure it's the same now, is pretty robust. It's a business degree, but we had to take quite a bit of engineering classes. We had to take geologic classes, legal classes, finance classes. So it's a business degree, but it was a fairly well-rounded degree. And I actually did a lot of work in the field. In college, I was a pumper and a mechanic and a roustabout and a roughneck for several years. I really loved the roughnecking. It was exciting. You made a lot of money. I could make more money in a weekend than my friends could make, working a whole month at the shoe store. So I loved doing that. But one day my dad said, son, it's not a profession for a family man. You might want to think about doing something other than roughnecking. I might still be doing it, but so I love that. And so it gave me a really balanced background. And I really wasn't, I've always been pro nuclear, but I can't say that I ever was actively pro nuclear, because when you're in a 70-hour a week job and you have 3 kids and a wife, you don't even have time for yourself, much less time to advocate for somebody else's industry. So I really did not come back around to nuclear until around COVID time is when it started to change. During COVID, we're all locked down. All my grown kids moved back home, and we're all stuck inside together. And I decided, well, I take it back. At the time, I was teaching energy classes at University of Oklahoma, and I always felt like I needed to be well prepared, because a lot of the students I were teaching were really smart, and I needed to be sure that I was on my game. So I did something that was kind of questionable, but I decided I would read all the policy positions of all 20 plus Democratic candidates for president to see, how they felt about energy. And of course, most of them didn't have energy policies, and some of the energy policies were pretty ridiculous. But the one that really got me most incensed was Michael Bloomberg, because he's a smart guy. I don't necessarily align with him on a lot of issues, but obviously he's a smart guy. And he had on his website, if you elect me president, then we'll be 80% renewable energy by the end of my second term. And I'm like, it's not a matter of willpower. It's not a matter of money. That cannot happen. And it made me mad that somebody smart like that would pander to people and say what they wanted to hear, knowing that it wasn't true. And so I started to do more research about all the ways that this net zero carbon emissions goals and how this was all going to work. And at that time, as I was going through that personal exercise, it occurred to me that we're really not going to do serious decarbonization without much more nuclear energy. We're not going to, industrial society cannot take place with renewables alone. And so I started to think about nuclear as coming back home to nuclear energy and saying, if we want to do something serious about good energy policy, we need to look more seriously at nuclear energy. So that was kind of where I started to get back into it. And I guess the time that I finally got radicalized into supporting nuclear energy was a year later. I guess is about April or May. I think it was the end of April 2021. They closed Indian Point Power Station in New York. That was perfectly good.
What was Indian Point?
So Indian Point was a great, beautifully run, as Emmett Penny would say, industrial cathedral of clean energy. It was a great, great site. And basically it was closed down for purely political reasons. Governor Cuomo of New York was under pressure from a bunch of Manhattan socialites to close it down. And it was closed down. It was providing 25% of the electricity to New York City and something like 50% of all the renewable energy in the state of New York. It was just, not renewable, but clean energy in the state of New York. And it made me angry. I'm a very big fan of Robert Bryce, and Robert, he normally podcasts, his Power Hungry podcast is once a week, but he was so incensed after Indian Point that he did a series, 4 days in a row of podcasts. He called them Indian Point Blackout Week. And he was trying to highlight the stupidity of closing down Indian Point. And by the time I got through listening to his 4 consecutive episodes of the Power Hungry podcast, I was ready to run through a wall to save, existing nuclear power plants. And I mean, I wasn't advocating necessarily for new nuclear power. I just felt like it seemed obvious to me that the lowest hanging fruit on clean energy was to keep existing power plants open. You've got all these nuclear power plants that are trying to be shut down, and they're cheap, they're safe, they're reliable, they're clean, and to shut them down for purely political reasons made me very angry. So that's how I really got started on my venture into nuclear energy.
Gotcha. I want to back up a little bit. Your time in oil and gas, I mean, you like you said, you weren't working in nuclear. You've had a career putting holes in the ground and going out securing land and looking at the regulatory side. In your experience or in your time in oil and gas, had there been an attitude that, did they view, or did anyone in the industry view nuclear as a competitor? Was there any anti-nuclear sentiment in your experience? Talk to us a little bit about that.
I have never heard anyone in my industry say anything negative about nuclear energy. Now, obviously, I don't know all 4 million employees, people that are employed in oil and gas. And obviously, there's going to be somebody that's going to be anti-nuclear. But as a general rule, I don't know anyone in my industry who is anti-nuclear. And I really haven't heard of any overt efforts. Now, in Oliver Stone's recent movie, there was he alluded to the fact that maybe back in the 70s, maybe there were some efforts by, I'm not even sure, I'm going to say what organization, maybe there was an organization back then. I think the Rockefellers maybe were involved. And so maybe there was some shenanigans back in the 70s where some oil and gas executives may have been.
Jack Devaney has a good history on this. So he's the founder of Thorcon, and he's put together a synopsis because there's I'll say theory within the nuclear industry that oil and gas was out to get them. They said, oh man, this is the only industry that can displace us, and they might be a competitor, and so we need to go out and take them out. And people point to the Rockefeller Foundation funding some of the research that went behind LNT, or the linear no threshold theory. And when you go back and look at the history, actually, Jack Devaney points out the Rockefellers weren't really associated with oil and gas at all anymore. By the time they started funding that research, it was really almost an atonement that they wanted to get away from energy, and it was kind of an elitist classist effort more than anti-nuclear. So there's one other example that he gives about the CEO of Arco making one donation, but then never making a second donation because I think it was to the Sierra Club, went out and basically just smeared oil and gas. And he's like, well, that was dumb. I'm not going to make any more donations, right? Like, so I've struggled with it, and I'll echo your sentiment, right? Spending my career in oil and gas, a lifetime in oil and gas, like, growing up in family, never heard any anti-nuclear sentiment ever.
No, it's just not there.
Yeah.
And anybody who thinks that, I mean, even if it happened in the 70s, which that's doubtful, it hasn't happened in recent history. And I certainly
It's 50 years ago, right? Like,
yeah, it's really ludicrous. And if they really believe that, then they're misinformed.
right.
I think that people in oil and gas, whatever you think about oil and gas, we have the ability to recognize good sources of energy and less good sources of energy, inferior sources of energy. I think we're very attuned to what's good and what's bad. And so I think even though we're not in nuclear energy, we can recognize another great energy source and acknowledge that without, any shame or apprehension. So I think generally oil and gas people are pro nuclear.
Well, and that's a good pivot point. Let's transition to the project. What is it? Give us some background. Why did you get started? Yeah.
So before I quite get right to that, let me just
okay. Yeah.
Tell you the final steps to my story back to nuclear. So I was radicalized by Robert Bryce, and actually one of the four guests that he had during that time was Mark Nelson. Of course, you and I both know Mark really well.
Love Mark.
And I love Mark, and super smart guy. And so I started paying more attention to I loved what his interview was with Robert Bryce. So I started going and looking other places and found that he was, interviewing with Decouple and other places. So, and I generally, as a professor at University of Oklahoma, I generally try and post things on LinkedIn or much to a lesser degree on Twitter, but I try and talk about energy from an educational standpoint, not from a political standpoint. I try and whatever I'm writing, whatever I'm saying, I'm trying to bring us all up in our energy intelligence and not really make things political. And I do that because, that's the right thing to do, but also because if you start getting overtly political, then you lose half your audience with the first sentence of your article. And then not to mention the fact that my kids hate for me to get political. So, I don't normally get political in anything that I write or post. But later that summer, right on the heels of Indian Point, Illinois was getting close to closing Byron and Dresden nuclear power plants. And I was following that just from a distance. I wasn't involved in the efforts to save that. A lot of my friends were involved in saving those plants, but I was just on the periphery. But a few days before the vote was being taken by the legislature in Illinois, I did get a little political, and I wrote a post on LinkedIn that said, Democrats aren't serious about about climate change, because if they were, they would not be shutting down Byron and Dresden. Of course, I got a lot of blowback from that post, but it was true, and I felt like it was, they eventually, unbelievably, saved those plants by a vote or two. But I think that was a turning point, because after Indian Point, it really roused a lot of people's awareness of the tragedy of shutting down all these nuclear power plants. Then they saved Byron and Dresden. And so it was shortly after that I connected with Mark Nelson, and I said, what can I do to help the cause? And so he pulled me in and got me involved in a lot of these advocacy groups to save Diablo Canyon and other things. I wasn't real active in a lot of those groups. I was really trying to listen and learn. I was the only oil and gas guy in a lot of those groups. As Mark would say, sometimes I was his token oil and gas guy. And he'd said, we need to build a broader consensus for nuclear, and having oil and gas people involved was good. But normally I would just sit and listen to these meetings and occasionally donate some money or a little bit of time. But then Mark said, the next thing you can do if you really want to get involved is come with me to Berlin, and we're going to go protest the shutdown of Germany shut down 3 nuclear power plants in December of 2021. And so I went with Mark, and I met a lot of Europeans. They had people from maybe 20 or 25 countries that showed up to, I won't say it was a protest. It was a demonstration or a rally to show their concern about shutting down these nuclear power plants. And so from that point forward, then I really got much more active in the cause of A, saving nuclear power plants, and then B, let's have an honest discussion about what we can do to increase the amount of nuclear power we have on our system. So Then fast forward to last fall, so we get to the current initiative. Last fall, I was sitting on a conference call with a bunch of nuclear advocates in California. And again, like I said, I normally just sit and listen. I normally don't actively participate. I'm listening and learning. And someone said, well, we know that all the oil and gas people hate nuclear energy. And we know that they actively try and undermine our industry. And I'm like, wait a second, that is just not true. That is not what, and I mean, I really
Totally
believe it.
false.
And so I spoke up, and I won't say who, but I said, so you're wrong about this. I do not believe that's true. I said, I don't know everyone in the oil and gas business, but I have never met anyone that doesn't support nuclear energy. And I doubt that there's shenanigans going on behind the scenes where oil companies are undermining nuclear energy. So, but after the meeting, I started to second guess myself and think, well, maybe my paradigm's wrong. Maybe I assume that everyone thinks the way I do. So I started asking around, to see if I could find anyone who did not support nuclear energy. And to this day, that's been 8 months ago. To this day, I have not found a single person in our industry who does not support nuclear energy. Again, I'm sure there's someone, but I don't know them. And so then I started to think, I've been working on, with these folks for a year and a half or 2 years. I've been trying to think of a way that I could actually do some good for the cause, because up to this point, other than traveling to Berlin and holding a sign that says, Germans don't shut down your nuclear plants, I hadn't really done very much meaningful. And so I had this idea that how powerful would it be if we had a whole bunch of industry executives in the oil and gas industry come out and openly support the use of nuclear energy. Oil and gas executives who gain nothing from doing that, but they would still support nuclear energy. You don't hear people in solar industry coming out in support of coal industry. You don't hear people in the wind industry coming out in support of oil and gas. So I thought this might be a powerful idea. So I slept on it a couple of days, and then I thought, I like the idea, but I'm not sure what to do with it or where it would go. And I wasn't sure I really had the gravitas to pull it off. So I called our mutual friend. Actually, I texted Chris Wright, the CEO of Liberty Energy. And of course, he is probably the one of the greatest leaders in our industry in terms of being out there in front, messaging and real common sense policy, and not afraid to say what he thinks.
He's the audio for our intro.
Okay, so Chris is the best.
We took a clip, or we got permission from him to use a clip from a speech that he gave. Yeah, talking about being proud.
So I actually texted Chris. And Chris is a busy guy, so it was very heartening to me when he almost immediately texted me back and said, I love this idea, let's do it. So I started to put together what we eventually called the Declaration of Oil and Gas Executives in Support of Nuclear Energy. And it took longer than it should have to put this together, but I do have my own real job. I do have a family. I've got other things to do. It ranged over the ensuing 5 months. It ranged from 1 page to 6 pages in length, trying to get the right length, the right tone, the right facts. And so finally, in March, I started to hone in on something that I thought was pretty good. And it was about 2 pages long. And so I sent it to several people, including you, who gave me some advice and some feedback. And then after I got all the feedback, and Emmett Penny gave me some great feedback. Liz gave me some great feedback, Liz Madsen. But the final analysis, as you know, Mark Nelson came into town to go skiing one weekend. When I picked him up at the airport, we met at the bar. You met us at the bar, and we sat down and kind of hammered out the final language of this. So then I emailed Chris,
which was super fun. I have to comment on this experience, right? So we were sitting down, wordsmithing over beers about how we transform this message, and I don't know. It was a wonderful experience for me, so I really appreciate you.
Yeah, and thank you for being a part of it. And so then I emailed Chris, and I said, I think we finally got something. I wasn't even sure if he'd remember months ago saying what a good idea this was, but he immediately said, oh no, this is great. And I said, well, I'd like to email it to you to look at, so that, you can tell me what your comments are, because I'd like you to be the first person to sign it. What are your comments before? And he says, I'm sure it's great. Bring it over. So I took it over to his office and gave it to his personal assistant. And the next morning I got a call and said, Chris has signed it. He loves it. And so we're off to the races. So you and I signed it, and we started getting other signatures on it. And this has been less than 2 months ago. 7 weeks ago was the first signature. And since that time, we've got over 65 executives who have signed it. Some really big names. I think there's power in the big names, but there's also power in numbers. And so we continue to move forward with, my first goal was to get 50. Now we're over that. My next goal is to get 100. And, who knows? It's a lot of work to get people to sign up, because the people we're trying to approach are very busy executives and just getting a piece of their time.
They've got a full-time day job. They're trying to produce energy for the world, right? Like leading companies and industry to,
Yeah, so it's a really cool project, and I think when we're done with it, I think we're going to go out and talk to people like you about it. We've got lots of offers for podcasts, but it seemed appropriate that Fire to Fission was our first one, and we've got some newspapers and magazines who are interested in the story, so we'll see where that goes. And I kind of eventually think as time goes on, we'll just continue to garner signatures. And then if we have something come up either at a state level or on the federal level, say there's a new bill coming out to give some money or to change regulations or something, then we can leverage this into some support for whichever side of the legislative argument we want. We could mail out copies of these to all 50 senators and all the representatives in the U.S., or maybe at a state level. So I think this project could go on and on and on.
I love it. I've been thinking on this a lot. What do you anticipate being like a go public strategy? Posting the letter online or mailing it to some senators? What's your vision?
Well, we are going to post it online very soon. I had no idea how successful this would be, so we're kind of scrambling to catch up. But we do have a website, which I saw the beta version last week, and I think we'll have a website up by this coming week, which will have the declaration where you can go to the website, look at the declaration, and then you can go to another page where it won't see everyone's signature, but you see a list of all the signatory parties to it. And we've got a couple of other pages in addition to that, some nuclear resource page and other things like that. So that's the first thing. We have been invited by some newspaper organizations, which I'm not going to get into who they are right now, to submit a op-ed about nuclear energy, the need for, what this is really about is the need for more common sense energy policy. What we have here is we have energy permeates virtually every aspect of our life. It is the lifeblood of every modern economy. Every other industry relies on safe, reliable, and affordable electricity or energy in order for that business to survive. And yet most people in the U.S. and most people in the world take energy and electricity for granted. They don't think about, when they turn on the light switch, where does it come from? All the people that were involved in making it happen. And some of our energy policies right now are grossly unrealistic. I'm afraid we're going to spend a lot of money on things that don't work, and we would have been better off spending that money maybe on some nuclear power plants or something else. So this is really about public policy and trying to educate the public. So our goal is not nuclear energy in and of itself. My goal, is to have better energy literacy, better energy intelligence. And if the public becomes more energy literate, we're going to have politicians who are more energy literate. They're going to make better decisions. And so that's where we're going with this, is better energy policy that will help the country and the world.
Awesome. What are some of the recommendations? The format of the letter got down to 2 pages, right?
Yes.
And so, you just voiced some of the message that I think the first half of it covers, right? And then kind of the second half discusses some recommendations. Do you want to chat about any of those?
Well, I'm going to go from memory here. I don't have a copy of it in front of me, but first of all, we need to get I think this could be the bipartisan issue of our time. We need to get political parties together, because we may have different parties and different political people across the political spectrum advocating for nuclear for different reasons. But I think we can all agree that more nuclear energy is going to be necessary and good for the country.
Really good for humanity. Absolutely.
Good for humanity.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter whether you're doing it for strictly climate reasons, or if you're strictly doing it because you're a nuclear engineer, or whatever your reason, it doesn't matter. I think that we should try and get a more bipartisan support for nuclear energy. And we're seeing that in a lot of places. We're seeing it at the federal level. We're seeing it in a lot of states now. Illinois just lifted, correct me if I'm wrong, just lifted their ban on new nuclear energy. Illinois is a very democratic state, so the fact that they were able to pass that by a wide margin,
and it was a big swing. It was like it's 84-22 or something like that. It was
exactly.
Yeah.
And shout out to all of our friends in Illinois who helped make that happen. Maddie Hilly, Mark Nelson, probably Eric Meyer was involved. I know Alan Metzger was hugely involved in that. Probably Liz Matson was as well. So all those people who helped make that happen, that is fantastic. Unfortunately, there are places where that has not become a bipartisan issue yet. And Colorado, the state where you and I both live, it's still pretty anti-nuclear on the Democratic side. So we've got some work to do there. So that's one thing, is to get the political parties aligned to move forward on this. And we've got to make we need some changes of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, obviously. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has lost its way in some ways. I don't want to come down too hard on them, but the reality is they are a big holdup on permitting. And I think that if we're going to we've got, I think I've heard that we have almost 50 new nuclear designs of some sort coming down the pipe. And I don't know how we're going to even evaluate even a small percentage of those with the regulations and the staff that we have, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So we got to make some changes there. I heard the other day on somebody else's podcast, and so I'm going to quote them, and I haven't verified these figures. I think they're probably in the ballpark, but I heard that the application process for one recent nuclear company, just the application process to the NRC, was 17,000 pages long. And then the supporting documentation was 4 million pages long. How does
I'm not surprised.
How does the
I've heard similar
regulatory
numbers.
agency? Yeah. So
I think Kairos spent 17 or 18,000 hours of the regulator's time, and they pay by the hour, right? $290 an hour. So that's several $1 million that they've spent or paid to the regulator for what? There's no reactor built. So, and we come at this from oil and gas, where we're actively generating a lot of energy, and there's a permitting process. We think it's sufficient and safe. And yes, you can always spend more money and more time to make improvements, but is the return on that money and time beneficial? Are we actually saving lives or saving years of life by adding these regulations compared to other ways that we could invest our time and money?
they've gotten good at saying no, and we need to get to the position where we can say yes to something. And I believe, I hate to quote, but I believe that Doomberg recently said that they would take over the job of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for much less money than what we're paying the NRC to do their job. And they would do it for much less because all they have to do is say no. They could do the same job at much less price. So we've got to get the Nuclear Regulatory Commission staffed up, and we have to have a better attitude of being open-minded to actually approving something to get done. And then another thing that we have to do is a very important thing we need to do is amend the way that market regulations on how we buy and sell and generate electricity, because the market design is important. We supposedly deregulated the electricity business in a bunch of states 10, 15 years ago. Supposedly. We didn't deregulate it. We re-regulated it in a different way. And so it's still regulated. And unfortunately, the regulations are being used in a way to favor wind and solar and disfavor other energies types like oil and gas, but in particular, nuclear energy. And so there are a lot of nuclear power plants in the country that are uneconomic in the current market environment because they've been forced off the grid to be used only when wind and solar, can't provide electricity. So they produce intermittently. And nuclear, as we all know, works best as a base load. There is some ability to load follow, but it works best as a base load. And so when you relegate them to just a backup to wind and solar, they're not economic. And so a lot of these plants are being shut down, and the wind and solar industry then say, or others say, maybe not just wind and solar, but others say, well, nuclear is no longer economic. Well, it's not economic because the market design, you forced them
Yeah.
out of the market. So we have to have market design
not
reform.
adequately compensating for all the value that's provided to society.
Exactly. So I think market reform and NRC reform are probably of the ones the two most important.
Yeah. So, I mean, these were recommendations that were in the letter that oil and gas executives then read. I mean, you've reached out to, like you said, a bunch of people, and there's been very positive response that people agree. I mean, these are the leaders of the fossil oil and gas existing incumbent industry that read these points and they say, yes, this makes sense. We're pro energy. We want more nuclear. We want more energy and prosperity. And we think that this should be something that should be talked about. So you've garnered support for it.
The vast majority of the people that I have asked to sign have signed almost immediately. I'm amazed how many people I get a hold of an executive of a major company and I say, would you be interested in supporting this? Toby Rice at EQT. I get it. I
CEO
send him
of EQT.
CEO of EQT. I send him an email, and within 30 minutes, he's not only agreed, but he signed it and sent it back. There are some executives who can't sign because of political considerations, so they'll send me a note back and say, I would love to sign it. I support nuclear energy, but my board of directors says it's not appropriate for me to sign it. So I've had a handful of those people. I've had a few that haven't answered me, but the vast majority, if I've asked them,
but you've also had some that have come out of the woodwork, or they told their buddies about it, or some of their friends, or executives at other companies, and then they, a signed letter will show up on your desk, and you didn't even reach out to them, right? Like
exactly. I reached out to a friend of mine in Oklahoma one day, and then a couple hours later, I got a signed letter from Bud Brigham at Brigham Exploration, and he had heard about it through the grapevine, and I mean, he immediately sent it back, and then he sent it to a couple of his friends who signed it. We had the founder of Inveris, who I never even met, never sent it to, and he's emailed me a signature. So, yeah, I have not had anyone. I've not had a single person, not one oil and gas executive has said, I will not sign it because I don't support nuclear energy. And I think that's a very powerful message to the public and to policymakers and to our politicians.
Yeah. I love it. Well, Doug, I'm very excited to kind of go public with this and to see the impact that it's going to have. I think it's going to have a really, really awesome message. It's a great story. You identified how you could help in this narrative, in this process. We're similar in that we see some policy decisions being made that we, as energy experts, right, people that feel qualified to speak on these issues, say this doesn't make a lot of sense. I don't think this is going to work. Like, we need to do something to change it. And you really, I mean, you didn't sit on your hands. You were proactive and went out and created something that is going to be valuable. So I thank you for the effort that you put into it and the project.
I thank you for helping write the declaration. I thank you for seeing the vision of this. I thank you for having me on the podcast today. So yeah, I think it's a great project. It's kind of it's a labor of love. I mean, I don't work in the nuclear energy. I don't get paid by the nuclear energy, either under the table or over the table. So for both of you and me, this is a labor of love, and we think we're doing the right thing for society. We're doing the right thing for the United States, and we're doing the right thing for the rest of the world. There's millions, billions of people that still do not have access to electricity, whose lives could be so improved with just a meager amount of electricity, meager amount of energy. And so I think we're doing something good for the world.
I totally agree. Do you think this will live on and be kind of an evergreen project? What's the future look like?
Well, I'm hoping so. I mean, I'm limited in the amount of time I can spend on this.
Yeah, you can only send so many emails, right? But we need to set up a system that people can support and otherwise, or perpetually, right?
Yeah, I think this could go on for a while. I mean, I don't know how long I'll actively solicit. I was kind of hoping to become self-perpetuating, that I get somebody and then people would invite their friends and then I wouldn't even have to ask anybody anymore. But that hasn't been the case. You really, with these important people, these executives, you do have to run them down.
They expect a personal invitation.
They do. But I do expect this to go on. And then, like I said, I think as this kind of goes on for years, maybe a year or two, as legislative initiatives come up and there's an opportunity for us to influence the decisions that are made, we can use this declaration of support as a way to convince people to support nuclear energy in the public sector. So yeah, it's gonna live on.
Excellent. Doug Sandridge, really appreciate the time. Thanks so much for chatting with me.
Thanks. See you when you get back to Colorado.